Monopsony is when there's one buyer. When you're the only buyer and people want to sell something, well, you can start bringing the price down. If you want to sell your labor, there's actually usually a very small number of people that you could get a job from. It's not perfect competition. If you just did a supply and demand graph and you start drawing a minimum wage on there, you discover, like, lo and behold, if you raise the minimum wage above the market clearing wage, then that causes unemployment. But if you start drawing these monopsony models, the wage in that model is already actually too low because the monopsony, there's not enough employers, are driving wages down. And so if you raise wages by raising the minimum wage, then in that model, you actually increase employment. When you build a mathematical model, you're communicating something using math. And you don't have to build a mathematical model. You can build a verbal model. What language should your model be in? Well, it should be in whatever language is like the best one to communicate it with. If that's words, then it's words. If putting the model into math makes it harder to understand, then like you've just done a disservice to your readers.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. Support starts at $1 a month or £1 a month or whatever the equivalent is wherever you live. And no matter what level of support you give, you get early access to all of our episodes and patron-only episodes where you can ask me and Patricia MMT questions. A big thank you to all of our supporters so far. At the beginning there, you heard our guest this week, economics scholar, teacher and writer, Sam Levey. And in a moment, we're going to be talking to him about the tension between real existing economic conditions and some of the models that many policymakers and their advisors have internalized. We think these things are important because many governments running so-called advanced economies around the world implement real policies with real consequences on real people using unreal ideas about how things work. And we think it's become vital to change our own understanding about these things in order to know what to push for if we want to create the conditions that will literally save the planet and save lives. If you're new to MMT, you might want to check out our first 3 episodes for an easy-to-understand introduction, but if you want to dive in here, as discussed many times on this podcast, currency-issuing governments like those of the UK, the US, Japan, Canada and Australia are the source of their own spending money, which means they can't run out of that spending money. Governments like these spend by using computer keystrokes at their central banks, and even though it's tautological to say that currency-issuing governments can't run out of currency, it's still true and uncontroversial. And so what's actually amazing is how many times in a year a government can remember this fact and then immediately forget it. What's that? The banking system's undergoing systemic risk due to our economic mismanagement? We just remembered we can supply money to banks in whatever quantity needed to make that risk go away. What's that? Your body is undergoing systemic risk due to our economic mismanagement? Well, we can supply poverty in whatever quantity needed to make you go away. And this is because from the government side, having infinite spending power comes with infinite responsibility, which presents a dilemma. The government can either put too much spending power into the economy and risk inflation, or leave too little spending power in the economy permanently and ensure unemployment. On the one hand, people hate inflation, and on the other hand, unemployed people are easily conditioned to blame themselves. And so unemployment wins as a policy choice, and so that's the way we manage our national economy. In the UK, 9 well-paid people get together at the central bank every 6 weeks and decide how many unemployed people they can live with. Spoiler alert, it's a lot. And the threat of falling into this buffer stock of unemployed people disciplines the wage demands of the rest of us and keeps inflation in check. Again, there's nothing controversial about this description. It's called monetary policy. And it's a brave and unending mission to find the natural rate of unemployment. And if you do happen to find yourself in that buffer stock of unemployed people, you can take solace in the fact that as an inflation fighter, you're actually an essential worker doing nature's work, and you should get a raise. There is an alternative. MMT economists say that the way modern money systems work means that the government, the issuer of currency, has no choice but to run a buffer stock system of one kind or another. And so the question is, what conditions should people in that government-created human buffer stock be experiencing? If they're unemployed and not given enough to live on, a private sector employer can offer a barely subsistence wage to coerce an employee out of this pool of traumatized people. And that's the way a lot of employers like it. Less money spent on staff means more money for trips into space with William Shatner. But what if, instead of moving people into involuntary unemployment as a consequence of monetary policy, what if the government took responsibility for its actions and became an employer of last resort? If the government did this, if it guaranteed a job that paid a socially inclusive wage that included conditions like healthcare, childcare, paid leave, and paid sick leave, then the private sector would have to offer better to attract a worker. This puts a floor under the conditions people can experience in the economy, maximizes the public good, and stabilizes prices all at the same time. An employed buffer stock is better than an unemployed one on a point of logic, and the only thing standing in the way of better is the inability of a small number of people to let go of some outdated ideas. So we're going to be talking to Sam about this in a moment, but for more on how the job guarantee works, you can listen to our episodes 4 and 47, which I've linked to in the show notes for this episode, along with some other things that came up in the conversation. And as ever, I've linked to where you can support this podcast financially via patreon.com/MMT podcast. Support starts at $1 a month or £1 a month or whatever the equivalent is wherever you live. And no matter what level of support you give, you get early access to all of our episodes and patron-only episodes where you can ask me and Patricia MMT questions. We're 100% listener funded. Your financial support really helps keep the show going. And your support in other ways, whether it's by recommending us to other people or just by listening and spreading the word about this stuff, really helps too. So thanks as ever for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive in. Welcome one and all to the MMT podcast. I'm Christian Riley.
And I'm Patricia Pino.
And it is our great pleasure to welcome back MMT scholar, teacher and writer Sam Levey. Thanks for joining us again today, Sam.
Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.
We thought we'd kick things off by looking at your recent Medium post entitled Buffer Stocks, A Simpler Diagram, because as you write, buffer stocks are a key concept for MMT. Can you give our listeners an overview of how buffer stocks are a key concept for MMT?
Sure. So a buffer stock is actually, it's a price stabilization scheme, and it's something that really kind of comes from agricultural economics. So, you know, if you're growing corn or something, I don't know, I'm not a farmer, but if you're growing corn or whatever, and, you know, 1 year there might be a bad harvest, so you don't get as much corn this year as you did last year. Or maybe this year, for whatever reason, the soil is doing great and you get a very plentiful harvest and there's way more corn than you were expecting. And so agricultural commodities, for those and other kinds of reasons, can be very, very volatile in how much, you know, how good the harvest is this year, or those kinds of things. And also, especially because some commodities are more difficult to store than others. So that translates, if you live in a world of like auctions, right? That translates to a lot of variability in price. You get a really good harvest. There's a ton of corn everywhere. It's easy to come by. Everybody's got it. You know, people are bidding against each other. The price drops a whole bunch. Or you've got a bad year. You've got a famine year, whatever it is. There's not enough to go around. The price goes way up, right? So the idea of a buffer stock is to reduce some of that variability. So somebody's running a buffer stock, and oftentimes it's the government, but doesn't technically have to be. And what they do is, to prevent the price from falling below some level, they will buy the excess, right? If there's too much corn, they'll buy some that stops the price from falling. To prevent the price from rising above some level, they will sell excess into the market, right? So if there's not enough corn, prices are rising, they'll sell some corn out of their own stock. So this is why it's called a stock, right? They've actually got an inventory of the thing, and they buy and add to that inventory or sell out of that inventory to reduce the variability in the price, right? One example that Americans might be a little more familiar with would be the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. It's not like a really tight, true buffer stock, but it's similar kind of principle. That when there's a lot of oil, the Strategic Reserve buys some, and then when there's the prices are rising or there's not enough or whatever, they sell some out of the Strategic Reserve. They did that just a few months ago. They've been doing that to stop the price of oil from rising so fast. So it's a similar kind of thing. And it can be tighter or looser, right? Like one kind of loose strategy is like, oh, okay, just kind of buy some when there's a lot and sell some when there's not enough without thinking too hard about it. But another strategy is like a real tight price control strategy. And that works like this. You'd have some price that is the buy price. Okay, so you're the buffer stock scheme operator, and you set a price called the buy price, and you will buy any amount that the market wants to sell to you at that price. So if anybody comes to you with corn or whatever it is at your buy price, you will buy it from them at however much it is, any amount. And then on the other side, you set a sell price, which is if anybody comes to you looking for corn or whatever, you will sell it to them at that price, right? As much as they want. Okay. And that can be sort of maybe riskier, right? Because you're agreeing to sell however much the market wants, right? However much corn they want. So you better have enough to back that up. But it also gives you tighter control over the prices, right? Because let's suppose that the market price goes above the price that you're willing to sell the corn at. Well, if I'm a corn buyer, why on earth would I buy from the market at a higher price than I could buy from you selling corn? So I'm going to go to you. And so if nobody's willing to buy corn at this higher market price, that price is going to drop. So you selling corn at the sell price is going to prevent the market price from going above that price. If you're doing this really well, like ever, like it'll never go above the sell price. Okay. And on the other side, if you're buying corn at some price, okay, well, suppose I'm selling corn, and let's say that the market price of corn is actually below the buying price that the buffer stock, are willing to buy at. Well, why would I want to sell to those people when I could just sell to the buffer stock? If the buffer stock's buying at a higher price than the market price and I'm a seller, I want to sell to the highest payer, right? So I would not sell to anybody in the market. I would sell to you, the buffer stock. And so that means the market price cannot go below your buying price ever, right? So the buffer stock buy and sell prices, if you're running it in this tight kind of way, form this corridor that the market price is confined within. The market price won't go below the buy price and won't go above the sell price of the buffer stock, and it can only fluctuate within that range. So that's what a buffer stock is. And what MMT does, and as far as I know, this is an original contribution of MMT. I don't know that I've seen this anywhere else. And if you look at like various articles, especially Bill Mitchell's got a few, and he's done some lectures on like what's new in MMT. One of the things that always gets cited is this use of buffer stocks. Now, MMT didn't invent the buffer stock. If you look into the history of these kinds of things, they go back thousands of years.
Bill actually, I think in an much earlier, a few years back post, he actually talks about agricultural buffer stocks as being a key inspiration for the construction of the job guarantee.
Yeah, exactly. He's got this story that he tells where he, is like, like driving in the Australian countryside or whatever, and sees these storage facilities where the government was keeping, like, I think wool is the story. They were running a buffer stock for wool, stabilizing the price of wool. And so he sees the facility where they're doing this, and he thinks, why can't we do this for labor as well? And that's kind of where Bill Mitchell's version of the job guarantee comes from.
I believe he was sitting in an agricultural economics class, like you say, it comes from agricultural economics, and thinking to himself, with the wool price stabilization scheme, I think it was called, this is a full employment of wool scheme. I don't care so much about wool, I care about people.
Yeah, because if you think about it, in the wool, if you're running the buffer stock for wool, there's always a bid for wool. There's always somebody who's willing to buy the wool at the market price. That's the buffer stock operator, or at least at their buy price, right? There's always somebody who is bidding on wool. But when we face unemployment, the exact problem is that there's nobody bidding on labor, right? You want to find a job at the market rate and you can't find one. There's nobody offering one, right? Or at least there are more job seekers than job openings. And so there's not enough bids for labor. And so exactly right. Buffer stock scheme is like a full employment scheme for whatever the the thing is. There's always somebody willing to buy. And so that's kind of the idea behind the job guarantee. Make it so that the government is always willing to buy labor, so that there's always a bid for labor. And like I say, I think this is an original contribution of MMT, is to use this buffer stock idea to help explain various parts of the macroeconomy and macroeconomic policy. And the job guarantee is probably the best example, because it's an important part of MMT. And of course it predates MMT, but still, like, I think MMT has really taken up that lineage, and you don't see it too many other places these days.
Am I right to infer that the job guarantee, as MMT described it, is the first, because obviously there's been policies like this in the past, but is the first that actually takes the buffer stock idea into account?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's correct. As far as I know, like, earlier proposals didn't use the same kind of buffer stock logic. And so that, I think, is an original contribution of MMT. But it goes beyond that too, because the same idea of buffer stock can also help you understand other things that are going on in the economy and the financial system that, as far as I know, weren't being described with buffer stocks before. So, like, one of the most important ones is fixed exchange rates. If you talk about how does a government set a fixed exchange rate if they want to peg their currency to another currency, or peg their currency to gold or something like that, right? Well, they run a buffer stock. They do the exact same thing, except instead of stabilizing the price of some commodity, they're stabilizing the value of the currency itself, right? It's kind of the same thing. It's just on the other side of the trade, right? So that's exactly how a gold standard works. Is you're buying and selling gold in order to fix the value of the currency to gold. And this is also why the job guarantee sometimes gets called the labor standard, because it's the same kind of thing, is you buy more or less labor in order to peg the currency to the value of an hour of labor. And there's a few other examples too, like bank deposits or whatever, and we could talk about some of that if you want, setting interest rates, that kind of thing.
You write in your piece that bank deposits conform to the description of a fixed exchange rate currency.
I've been reading a bit lately about the history of the U.S. monetary system. I'm going to be teaching that a bit in a class this semester, and so I've been trying to learn about it myself. And I think it's actually easier to understand this idea if you remember that right now, if you go to a bank, you open an account, okay? You open a deposit account. That's like it sits on the bank's books, that records that you have money at the bank or whatever. But it didn't used to be like that. Banks, by and large, didn't use deposit accounts so much. What they did was they would issue banknotes. Okay, so you would come to the bank and you would bring your state money, which at the time was like gold and silver coins that, say, the U.S. government issued. So you have gold and silver, you have coins in your pocket, and you bring them to the bank, and the bank gives you a piece of paper, a banknote, that says, $1, or they give you a whole bunch of them to, whatever it is, right? And so that, I think, makes it clearer that what the bank is doing is creating money, right? You're handing you a piece of paper. It's a paper money that has the name of the bank on it, and it says $1 on it, right? So it's much clearly bank created money in a way that people have a harder time understanding bank deposits to be today. But it's the same thing, really. You bring state money to the bank, and the bank gives you newly created bank money, right? And the key thing with the buffer stock is that these two currencies are pegged to each other, right? The bank is pegging its own notes to state money. So what does that mean? It means that $1 on a banknote, if you have a banknote that says $1, it says, Bank of America, and it says $1, you can bring it back to the bank and they will give you $1 worth of coins, government money. And so what they're doing is, how do they stabilize that price at exactly 1-to-1 so that it never goes up or down? Well, they're running a buffer stock. If there's excess banknotes out there, so people have more than they want, then they bring them to the bank and the bank redeems them. They buy them back and pay you using state money. On the other hand, if there's not enough banknotes out there, people want more than there are, then they come to the bank and bring state money, and the bank sells you the banknotes. So it's exactly the same thing. It's a buffer stock. They're buying and selling their own notes. You can think of it as issuing and redeeming, but buying and selling, same thing, to peg the price so that the value of the banknote, the $1 in your bank account, is always exactly equal to $1 of government money.
Just to bring it up to date, we are now talking about commercial bank created credit bank deposits, which are numbers on a spreadsheet with a pound sign or a dollar sign, depending on where you live. next to it on a commercial bank spreadsheet. And instead of these gold coins that you're talking about, we're talking about reserves or settlement balances. Am I right?
Yeah, it could be. Although it could also just be like, you bring a $20 bill to your bank, at the ATM or something, and they credit your account $20. When they do that, they are pegging the value of the bank deposit. They're making sure that it's exactly equal to its value in state money. This is called par, right? This is called trading at par, when $1 in your bank account is exactly equal to $1, a $1 bill from the federal government in the United States.
But to be clear, when we talk about state money, yes, some of it is in physical cash, but we mean reserves. I mean, really, the act of like withdrawing notes from an ATM, that's kind of like turning reserves into physical form, wouldn't you say? And now you can walk around with it.
Yeah, exactly. And if you think about it, the government's actually doing the same thing here. The government is running a buffer stock so that reserves, like bank reserves, settlement balances, accounts at the central bank, $1 in an account at the central bank is always exactly equal to $1 of paper money. And why is that? Well, it's because the central bank is running a buffer stock on this. It's right. If you're a bank and you bring, your pile of paper money to the central bank, they will take it from you. They're buying it from you by crediting your reserve account at the central bank. And in that way, the central bank is doing the same thing. They're running a buffer stock to ensure that reserve balances, settlement balances, are also exactly pegged to the value of paper money. So there's kind of buffer stocks all over the place once you start looking for them.
In your piece, after you talk about bank deposits as a form of fixed exchange rate, you also describe how buffer stocks are used by the central bank, as we touched on just then, to maintain their interest rate target. Now, can you walk us through how that works?
Sure. And it's actually a little bit different now than it used to be because of the floor system and interest on reserves. And I'm sure your listeners are familiar with some of that. So I'm going to maybe stick to the case that's more obviously a buffer stock, which is the way they used to do it when there was a corridor system. So I'm going back in time just a little bit, but it's still the same. It still kind of works. Okay. So I did just talk about one buffer stock that the central bank runs, which is to peg the value of reserve balances to the value of paper money to make sure those things trade at par with each other. But one of the other buffer stocks, as you're talking about, is setting interest rates. And so how do they do that? Well, in the buffer stock logic that's easiest to see is that they basically borrow and lend in order to hit an interest rate target. So how would this work? Well, let's suppose that there's what they do is they'd set a range, right? Which is like let's suppose it's like 1% to 1.5%. That's where they want the interest rate to be. So the central bank, because of their monetary policy, and they've got some idea about, the impacts of this thing on the economy and whatever, they decide they'd want the interest rate to be no lower than 1% and no higher than 1.5%. So how do they make this happen? In really the simplest terms possible, right? I'm abstracting a bit, but in the simplest terms possible, what they do is if the interest rate ever falls below 1%, they would jump in and start borrowing, right? Increase the demand for funds here, borrow in order to push interest rates up.
And when you say borrow, selling treasuries.
Yeah, typically the way they do that is they sell treasury bonds or treasury bills, but easier way to think of it is they're borrowing. So they're pulling funds out of the market that way, raising the interest rate. On the other hand, if the market interest rate went above their 1.5% ceiling here, then what do? They go in and they start lending, right? They lend funds into the market to bring the interest rate down into their range. And so that if they do that, then it's really the same thing as this buffer stock logic. They're basically buying and selling in any quantity to keep the price within their target range. And now when we're talking about par, if we're talking about, pegging reserve balances to paper money or pegging bank accounts to paper money, the range is there is no range. It's like the buy and the sell price are the same price, right? Exactly 1-to-1. But if we're talking about a range like between 1% and 1.5%, then there's a little more room, right? They buy or they borrow if the interest rate goes below 1%, and they lend or they sell if the interest rate goes above 1.5%. But then within that range, they don't care. They don't do anything. Although, of course, they could tighten that, right? They could move those closer and closer together. They could maybe make it, 1% and 1.25%, or 1% and 1.1%, or they could even just make it an exact number. They could just say the interest rate is going to be exactly 1.5%, let's say, and no higher and no lower. And how would they do that? They would do that by borrowing and lending to anybody in unlimited quantities at exactly 1.5%, right? And because if you can borrow in any amount at 1.5%, then you're not going to trade, you're not going to borrow from somebody else in the market who's charging a higher rate than that. And if you can lend to anybody at exactly you can lend to the central bank in any amount at exactly 1.5%, you're not going to lend to somebody who's offering you a lower interest rate than that out in the market, right? So if they did that, the market rate would always exactly be equal to their target, yeah? So that's kind of one of the things you can see in the diagram that I made. There's like this flat part of the supply and demand curves, and there's a gap in between them, and the size of that gap determines how much room there is for the price to move within, when the buffer stock operator doesn't have to do anything, but they could make that gap as narrow as they wanted until the lines are right on top of each other.
Could you just say how, when the corridor system ended, how that complicates that picture?
Sure. So what they did in the United States, this did happen around the 2008 crisis, and many other countries did the same thing, including the UK. And what they did was they just added lots and lots of reserves into the system. And how do they add reserves? They buy treasuries and loosely, okay, in the terms that I'm using here, you can think of it as they lent lots and lots of money into the market. Okay, so they're adding money into the market. So that should drive interest rates down. And if there were nothing stopping it, that would drive interest rates down to zero. But because they didn't necessarily want the interest rate to actually be zero, what they then went in and did is they started paying interest on the reserves, basically on the money itself. And because if I can earn, let's say 1% from just holding the money, okay, so the central bank's paying me 1%, let's say, interest on reserves, so I'm just holding these reserve balances, and it's paying me 1%. I'm not going to lend to somebody who's going to pay me less than that. Why would I do that if I could earn a higher interest rate just by holding it? And so paying interest on reserves stops the interest rate from falling below that.
I was appreciating the nice supply and demand curves in your article, and particularly you express a dislike for supply and demand curves in general, but you use them for simplicity purposes for some items. But when it comes to the labor market, you are adamant that they should not be used for that. So I just wanted to ask, why don't you like demand and supply curves when everybody loves them? And second, why do you definitely not like them when it comes to the labor market?
Sure. So this is a huge question, and we'll see how I do here, I guess. I'm not necessarily as opposed to the supply and demand model as some other heterodox economists are, but there is a lot of heterodox opposition to supply and demand, and I do think it's very well justified. Really, the problem is not supply and demand itself per se. The problem is that it gets used in all kinds of situations where it's not really applicable. Like the assumptions that are required for you to just draw a supply and demand curve and call it a day are actually quite strict and don't apply in lots and lots, if not most, markets. I just think you have to be really careful with it. So when I've taught it to students in the past, I'm like, yes, this is a useful tool. Yes, this is a good way to build intuition about certain economic concepts, but also you do have to be really careful with it because it can be really, really misleading if you apply it in the wrong context, right? I'll just give you some examples of what some of the issues are, okay? So one issue is just supply curves in general. And this isn't a heterodox critique per se. This is well known within mainstream economics. You cannot draw a supply curve unless you have what's called perfect competition. And perfect competition comes with its own whole set of assumptions. But for our purposes, the biggest one, or the most important one here, is that it assumes that all firms are price takers. So price taking, what does that mean? It means that the market is so big, there's so many different sellers and buyers on each side, that the actions of any individual firm have no effect whatsoever on the price. None. Okay. So, well, let's say I'm selling pillows or something. I don't know. The market for pillows has got to be so big, and I'm such a tiny part of it that I can't affect the price of pillows at all. Nothing I do can possibly affect the price of pillows. Okay. That's what it means to be a price taker. And are there some markets where maybe that's kind of true? Well, yeah, maybe like these really big, like global commodity markets, the market for coffee beans or something. Even in global commodity markets, you can end up with like these big monopoly situations or oligopolies and cartels and things like that. But still, let's, to at least to some approximation, those are big markets with lots of sellers, and it's very difficult for anybody to move the price at all. Like one example I give maybe of a situation where this applies is like, I can't remember exactly what it was, but at some point I was doing like a little hobbyist electronics project. Okay. And I needed like a little circuit components. I really can't remember what it was, but it was some little microchip that I needed. And I went on the internet and I was looking to buy this chip. And the website that I found where I could buy it listed like 20 different people selling the exact same chip. Okay. So they're completely identical, 20 different people selling them. And it listed the price for every single one, like right next to the name, right? So I was just looking at a list of, 20 prices that I could pay for this little chip I needed, right? And as far as I know, they're all completely identical, and I have no like brand loyalty to any of these people. I don't know anything about them. So what am I doing, right? I'm just looking at the price. I mean, if one of those prices was going to be even a penny more than another one, then like, okay, I'm going to go with the one that's a penny cheaper, I guess. I mean, I have no reason in this case to like whatever. So, right, that's a situation where there's a lot of price competition there. And so maybe if one of those firms had raised their price by 1 penny, they would have lost 100% of their business, right? Like that's what it means to be a price taker. So in that situation, you can start talking about supply curves, right? But you can prove that unless you're in that situation, you cannot draw a supply curve. The logic of how firms set prices just turns out to be more complicated than that when you're not in that situation. And so you can't even draw a supply curve, right? So that's one thing that I think a lot of intro to economics students don't realize. Like you can only draw supply curves in these very, very competitive markets. And most markets just aren't like that. If you go down to the corner store and you're going to buy, I don't know, soda or something, they could charge 10 cents more, 50 cents more, 20 cents less, whatever. And like, it's not going to affect their demand too much. They can't get too far out of line with what everyone else is doing, but they've got wiggle room. And as soon as they've got wiggle room, then your ability to draw a supply curve goes out the window. It just becomes untenable within its own logic, which I'm not going to get into exactly why that is. But it's a piece of standard economics that is taught in economics degrees, that you can't draw a supply curve unless you have perfect competition. And most markets aren't even close to being like that, right? So that's one problem. So that's like especially true in the labor market, kind of on the other side. Like even it used to be the case that mainstream economists would use supply and demand to talk about the labor market all the time. But actually in the last, I don't know, decade, maybe, they've moved away from that quite a bit. And now instead they're using models called monopsony models. Monopsony is like the evil mirror twin of Monopoly. Not the board game, but it's when there's one seller in the market. So you want to buy something, you can only get it from one place. Monopsony is when there's one buyer. You want to sell something, but only one entity is there to buy it. And what's the problem? Well, it gives them a lot of pricing power, right? If I'm the only seller and you want this thing that I'm selling, then I can charge you whatever I want, basically, up to some limit. But yeah, basically I can raise the price on you and there's not much you can do about it. Conversely, in monopsony, when you're the only buyer and people want to sell something, well, you can start bringing the price down. You can say like, hey, you want to sell that and you have to sell it to me because I'm the only buyer. So I'm going to lower the price. I'm not willing to pay that much. We're bringing the price down here. And so in these monopsony situations, prices go down and it hurts the seller. And what they're talking about here is usually the labor market. So they're talking about workers trying to sell labor. And it turns out, not really that surprising if you think about it, but they've now decided that labor markets are very, very concentrated. If you want to sell your labor, within like your zip code or, your commuting radius and within your like the skills that you have, and so your kind of segment of the job market, there's actually usually a very small number of people that you could get a job from. They've done a whole bunch of studies measuring this, and now there's kind of more and more of a consensus that labor markets are very concentrated on the employer side. If you want to get a job, there's only a small number of employers that are going to think about hire, or that you could think about getting a job from, that are realistic for you to get a job from. And so that means it's not perfect competition, right? You can't just do this supply and demand thing. Instead, wages are going to be lower than they, would be if we lived in this kind of perfect competition utopia. And so this is part of the explanation for why minimum wages don't cause unemployment. This is the mainstream explanation for this. Because if you just did a supply and demand graph and you start drawing a minimum wage on there, this is like an exercise that everybody has to do in like intro micro. You discover, like, lo and behold, if you raise the minimum wage above the market clearing wage, then that causes unemployment. And so the like conservative dogma for years and years has been raising the minimum wage sounds like a good thing. It sounds like it would help the poor, but by causing unemployment, it's actually a bad thing. It's going to make them all worse off. And so that's why we can't have a minimum wage. But if you start drawing these monopsony models that look a bit different, okay, they function differently because the wage in that model is already actually too low, because the monopsony, there's not enough employers, are driving wages down. And so if you raise wages by raising the minimum wage, then in that model, you actually increase employment. It doesn't cause unemployment. It actually decreases unemployment. So that's kind of been part of the logical revolution for why minimum wages are suddenly things that like mainstream economists support. Anyway, so that's just one long-winded example of why this tool is really problematic in the labor market. There's some other aspects too, like the shape of the curves are probably wrong in the labor market, right? Like, okay, the supply curve that people are used to think of, usually it slopes upward. Okay, so what does that mean?
A straight line, a linear relationship, yeah.
Yeah, often a straight line, although that's, just to simplify a bit, but it's upward sloping. And what does it mean for the curve to be upward sloping? It means that as the price falls, then you as the seller want to sell less of the good, right? Because like you could make more money doing something else, so you don't want to grow oranges if you're not going to make a lot of money from growing oranges. You'd rather grow apples or whatever it is, right? So in this story, as the price falls, you as the seller want to sell less. But for labor, that is probably not true, right? For labor, as wages fall, probably you actually need to work more, right? Because you have bills to pay and you have debts that you have to make payments on, and you have a certain target, lifestyle that's like the socially acceptable standard of living, so that you don't feel like you've been socially ostracized, so you got to keep up with the Joneses or whatever it is. So if your wages go down, you might actually want to work more so that you can earn the same amount of money, but, more hours at lower wages. So that means that the shape of the curve is wrong, right, for this kind of market. And there's a bunch of other stuff too, but I'm hoping that paints the picture for you of why you generally don't want to use supply and demand for a labor market. It leads to all kinds of wrong and generally conservative conclusions.
You mentioned that now economists sort of understand the flaws within the labor market and the use of the supply and demand curve. But university students are still taught that labor has a choice not to supply labor if wages fall too much, and that introducing things like welfare payments for the unemployed is an incentive not to work and things like that. And I'm just wondering, why are we not seeing more people speak the way that you are in universities? I
don't know. I think times change slowly. I don't know. What I've seen on Twitter is like a kind of young crop of let's say like center left or a bit liberal mainstream economists who have these more, I think in their minds, it's totally evidence-based. It's just like, I think for them, there's kind of a narrative that is to some extent true that mainstream economics used to be really, really like theoretically dogmatic, politically conservative, and unwilling to listen to any evidence. And the way these people understand recent history is that has changed. Mainstream economics has become more open to just evidence, even when there isn't strong theory to back it up. And I think to some extent it's true, although that hasn't led them to question like a lot of the foundational assumptions, right? They're like willing now to be more open to like, oh, it turns out like this policy doesn't cause unemployment, or it turns out like this policy doesn't trap people in poverty, or whatever it is, that like they're questioning some of the conservative policy outcomes. Not yet a wide questioning of the foundational, axioms of the whole system, but maybe we'll get there.
So this question of how prices are set goes to an earlier piece that you wrote on Medium called Monopoly Money Redux. And in it, I really like how you get the reader to think of the government as selling its currency for labor or goods as it spends money into existence to provision itself. But then once that money's in the economy, it's then resold by private sellers. So you've kind of got two prices going on. Could you unpack that a little bit for us?
Sure. The kind of overarching history here is, Warren Mosler comes along. He independently develops a lot of the ideas behind MMT. And one section of the ideas that I think he had developed especially well, and I'm not sure I've seen too much before him, is this idea of exogenous pricing, is what it's called. Meaning the government determines the price level when it buys stuff. So, we usually think the government, okay, they want to buy a jet. So they say, hey, Boeing or whoever, we want to buy a jet. How much is it going to cost? And so then Boeing tells them how much it's going to cost. But the government could do this other thing where instead of asking how much it's going to cost, they just tell you. They say like, hey, we're going to buy labor and we're going to pay you $15 an hour or whatever it is. And if you want to sell that labor to us at $15 an hour, great, we'll take it. If not, okay, bye. And so that's how the job guarantee works. And the price, therefore, is exogenous. Exogenous means like external or outside of the market, right? The government just comes in and decides what the price is going to be. And so this is like Warren Mosler's theory of the price level, right? Mainstream economics has a really hard time with this, with theories of inflation. And if you've been following the inflation debate over the last year, you've seen it, like a lot of different views, not a really clear consensus on what's the story on inflation. There was an article from like a Federal Reserve governor from a few years ago. The article was about how the Fed doesn't really have a good working theory of inflation, of how inflation really works. They've got some theories. The theories don't work very well. So this is a big problem for them. And so Warren Mosler kind of comes along with a solution that says, well, here's where inflation comes from. Here's where the price level comes from. It comes from the prices government pays when it spends. So if the government starts paying more for the same thing, then prices start going up, the price level rises. So that's where the theory comes from. And then an early attempt to like turn that into a mathematical model comes from Pavlina Cherneva in the early 2000s. She's got a paper, Monopoly Money, I believe, and she starts to kind of mathematize this a bit. And then what I do in that blog post, and then later it became a working paper with the Levey Institute, and I'm hoping in the next draft I'll clean it up some more and then submit it, to an economics journal, is mathematize this further and demonstrate the logic of what he's saying and show that this is like a valid way to understand how the price level works if you abstract in those terms. So that's kind of the history of the thing. And so the logic is very similar to this buffer stock logic, because you imagine we could be talking about a job guarantee or the gold standard or whatever, and the government says, hey, $15 an hour, that's what we're willing to pay for labor. Or maybe $35 an ounce, that's what we're willing to pay for gold. We're going to buy it and sell it at this price. And like I said before, if you're doing a good buffer stock, then the market price doesn't go away from that. It stays in that range or even right at that single price maybe. And so that links the currency to whatever you're paying to. And so what I did in the model is I've got, exactly like you said, there's sort of two kinds of transactions in the model. The government buys labor. I do the job guarantee version. The government buys labor. And then the private sector also buys labor. And there's nothing else in the model. It's just a really simple toy, small, abstract kind of model just to demonstrate this one thing. A lot of people have critiqued MMT on this, oh, where's your model? Let's see some math. Where's the mathematical model? This kind of thing. It's not real science until we see some math. And, I don't think that's true at all. But I did write this paper to shut some of those people up. That's kind of the purpose. Because math is a language. When you build a mathematical model, you're communicating something using math. And you don't have to build a mathematical model. You can build a verbal model, right? That doesn't have math, but it's still a model. And so like when Moore and Mosler or Randy Ray, they start talking about like, tickets to the Super Bowl or like Macy's gift cards, or like these are good analogies for money in the MMT lens. That is a model. Right? You're using like your intuition about a gift card as a model for trying to understand money, which is not actually a gift card, but it has a lot in common with gift cards. So that's a model in words. And the way I see it, what language should your model be in? Well, it should be in whatever language is like the best one to communicate it with, right? If that's words, then it's words. If putting the model into math makes it harder to understand, then like you've just done a disservice to your readers. It's like, why would I speak French to a room full of people that only speak Spanish? Maybe if you're like a computer programmer, nobody writes websites using like, I don't know, C++. Okay, people write websites with like JavaScript and HTML. The languages that are suitable for creating websites, those are the ones you want to use. So whatever language helps tell your story the best, that's what you should use.
Math can also have the ability to hide the assumptions inherent in a model as well. You can hide the assumptions a lot easier than you could in verbal means.
Very, very much so. And partly that's just because math is so sophisticated and confusing. It's like you have to be trained. I mean, it's true for any language. You have to be trained to speak it. But not as many people are trained to speak math as they are to speak English. And so a lot of people don't understand what you're saying, and you just kind of assume it's legit. But there might actually be some kind of pretty wild, crazy stuff in there because math as a language can also be very limited. Part of it is because you have to be specific in math. And so, you end up being forced to say things in order to make the problem solvable that you wouldn't say if you were using words, because you don't need to be exactly so specific or whatever. But still, you're exactly right. You can end up with wild and crazy stuff in there. And then people from the outside that haven't been trained just assume it's legit, even though it's actually totally crazy. So anyway, long story short, math is problematic, but it's also useful. And I made a little math model in order to shut up some of the people who are convinced that math is the only way to go.
It's very simple, but it's very effective at conveying the idea. And one of the things I note, let me know if I've interpreted this right, is that the reason why prices in the private sector converge towards the price that the government has paid is largely because the amount of money for resale in the private sector is a result of the money that the government spent in the previous period. Is that the right way of saying it in verbal means?
I think that's correct, but I think there's an easier way to understand it. And let me talk you through an example. Let's suppose for a second, this comes from Mosler, right? He does this one and I like it a lot. Let's suppose that all the prices in the economy went up for some reason. They go up, whatever, all of them. But the government refuses to pay more for stuff. So the government says, hey, all these prices went up. Let's say they went up 10% or something for whatever reason. And then the government says, hey, all these prices went up 10%, but we are not going to pay it. We're just not doing it, right? So what happens? Well, if the government's unwilling to pay the prices for the stuff they want to buy, then, well, guess what? People aren't going to sell them that stuff by and large. So the government now is not buying anything because they're not paying the right price for it, right? So what happens to government spending? It drops immediately to zero in this kind of, simple story. So the prices in the market go up and the government's unwilling to pay them. That means government spending just drops to zero. Meanwhile, taxes are still getting collected. So if you think about what that does to demand, to like aggregate demand, well, government spending is part of aggregate demand and it just dropped off a cliff. So aggregate demand goes way down because of that. But taxes are still getting collected, and so that's still, pulling out private income. So that's still pulling down aggregate demand as well. So in this situation, if the government really wants to hold really fast to the prices it's paying, then that's going to force aggregate demand way, way, way down. And that's going to force market prices down, right? Because suddenly demand has dropped off a cliff. Now there's too much supply and sellers are going to start dropping prices. You're going to get deflation. Right? Aggregate demand falls a whole bunch. You get prices falling, you get deflation until the prices come back to whatever the government is willing to pay. And then government spending goes back to its normal level. It stops being zero. And now aggregate demand gets stabilized. So that's like scenario one, if prices go up. That is how private prices track to the government prices in that direction. Let's imagine the other direction. Suppose that the government just says, hey, everybody, whatever prices we paid last year, we are now going to pay twice as much. So if we were paying you $15 an hour last year, guess what? This year we're paying you $30 an hour. And if we were buying this tank for like, I don't know, $10 million or something, guess what? Now it's 20 million. We're just doubling everything. We're just doing it. Okay, so if they do that, well, what's going to happen? So first of all, government spending just doubled, right? They're buying all the same stuff, but they're paying twice as much for it. So government spending just doubled. So aggregate demand is, in nominal terms now going up. And if the government is offering really high prices for stuff, then now there's some people in the market who, like sellers that were previously selling to private buyers, are now saying, well, hey, wait a minute. If the market price for this thing is like, $10 or whatever, but now the government's buying stuff for 20, maybe I'm going to try to sell to the government instead. And so private sellers are now like racing over to try to sell to the government at these higher prices, right? And that's going to force private buyers of goods to compete. And they are able to compete too because government spending went way up, so private incomes have gone up. So when the government does this, aggregate demand increases a whole bunch, and you've got demand that's going to be probably outstripping supply, and you're going to get price increases and inflationary pressures until prices settle at the prices that the government has announced it wants to pay. So that's kind of how this logic works. And the government doesn't normally operate this way. They don't normally say things like, we're not going to pay a penny more for this than we paid last year. They don't say that. And they don't normally just like double all their prices just cause. But the point is, if they decided to do either of those things and they really, really held fast to it, then that would force the private price level to rise or fall to meet whatever the government is trying to set it at.
Do you think there is a way of, or maybe you've already done this, but just how long it takes for the price to converge to what the government is paying?
I don't know. It's a kind of a hypothetical story because I don't know that that's ever been tried. I mean, like in like a policy move like that, right? I mean, because it's kind of crazy, and it would be sort of a disaster either way. On the one hand, the deflationary one is really, really crushing deflation, right? And it would cause all kinds of bankruptcies and businesses going under and stuff until prices came down to meet the government's level. So I don't know that that's ever happened quite like that. I mean, maybe if there's one case when maybe it applies, I would think like at the end of hyperinflations. Like there are some hyperinflations that are really, really raging and then come to a really abrupt end. They just suddenly are over. This has happened before. And my guess would be like, how did that happen? Probably something like this. Probably the government, changing a policy and really clamping down hard and saying, we're just not paying price increases anymore. And then maybe the inflation keeps going just a little bit, but then it sputters out because, government spending falls off and aggregate demand can't go up anymore. And so maybe that's a case where that has happened. I think it needs some historical study.
Yeah, I like this way of thinking about it. Sometimes we get asked, well, okay, so if the government's price setter, why do they not just stop inflation? And my takeaway from how you've relayed what Warren said, which I'm very fond of too, is that he's saying that, when the market demands higher prices, the government has those two choices. It can pay those higher prices, which if they're the price setter means revising the absolute value of the dollar down, otherwise known as inflation, or it can refuse to pay a penny more, like you say, than it is at the moment. And then both parties, the government, the non-government, they walk away not having made the transactions that they need to make together to get the dollars. The private sector needs to pay its tax bill. The whole economy crashes. So the government doesn't want to do that second option. And also it probably, as an organism, as an entity, doesn't know that it is setting prices in the economy anyway, right? It thinks it's just another user of currency rather than the source of currency. So the market's demanding these higher prices, and the government is 99% of the time ratifying those higher prices.
Maybe that's why we see hyperinflations during times of war. And I'm thinking that during times of war, you have, of course, scarcity of goods, but you also have a political urgency to acquire resources to continue on fighting that war.
Yeah, and I guess I'll also add that in some wars, governments get stronger, like state capacity grows. This was probably the case during World War II in the US. In other wars, state capacity actually is hurt, right? And the state comes out the other end weaker. And so one of the problems that happens during wars is if the state capacity is really damaged, then you might not be able to collect taxes in the same way as you could before, either because you're just physically not capable of doing it, or maybe because you don't have the legitimacy anymore to like levy the kinds of taxes you were before. And so that's another thing that is contributes to wartime hyperinflations, is like they're still trying to spend as much as they need to win the war, but all of a sudden they can't tax anymore. So to go back to the inflation thing, there's kind of 2 points I want to make. So number one, this thing about ratifying the private market, I think that's a really great word. And Mosler has said this as well, like they could manage inflationary pressures this way. Maybe they could refuse to pay a penny more, but it would probably be a disaster. And so instead what we do is we fight inflation indirectly, right? The market comes asking for higher prices, and instead of simply denying them that, we don't do that. Instead, what we do is we try to affect what's going on in the private market to prevent them from asking for higher prices, or to stop them from asking for further higher prices. So it's more of an indirect, and that's kind of our policy tool for fighting inflation. So we do ratify what they ask for, but then we try to influence what they're going to ask for so they don't ask for as much. And, we do that through aggregate demand management policies, and we do that through antitrust, so there's a lot of avenues there. So that's what I wanted to say about that. And then I want to make one more point about this, because I think this is cool and maybe helps get to the distinction between currency user and currency issuer. One person asked me one time as I was walking through the logic of this model, I think it was David Endelfado, and he asks, what is special about the government here? Why couldn't somebody else do this? Like, why couldn't Amazon? Amazon's really big. They make a lot of transactions. Why couldn't they do the same thing? Why couldn't they just double all the prices that they're paying? And why wouldn't that cause a bunch of inflation? Or why couldn't they do the same thing where they cut prices down and kind of force sellers to match them? Why couldn't they do that? What's special about the government? And the answer to that is really simple, actually. It's that the government doesn't run out of money. If you are going to suddenly pay your workers twice as much, Amazon is eventually going to not be able to do that, right? Like they're running down their bank accounts, running down their credit lines, running down their goodwill to tap financial markets. They eventually run out, whereas the state is only issuing its own currency, and so that's all they're paying with, so they don't run out. And so they can continue indefinitely on this policy, right? They can just stop paying higher prices for things forever, or they can just pay 10 times as much forever, and nothing forces them to stop, in the same way that Amazon would eventually be forced to stop by, a bankruptcy proceeding or something. So I've always said I would really like to write an article someday that was called A Modest Proposal, $1 million an hour job guarantee wage. And,
Love it.
And what would happen if we did
Swiftian,
that?
right?
Yeah, exactly. It's not serious.
But also to add to what you were saying, maybe that's why as well governments generally are less successful at maintaining currency pegs, because they don't issue the thing that they are using to control the price of a particular currency.
Yeah, whenever you peg anything, if you're running a buffer stock, then you have to have the thing, or at least have access to the thing that you're buying and selling, right? And so if you're running a fixed exchange rate, like if we're going to, I don't know, let's say for whatever reason you guys decided to peg the pound to the euro. So then if you wanted to do that, then the Bank of England would need to have euros, or have access to euros or euro-denominated credit or whatever, in order to do that. And if it runs out, then the game's up, right? This is true for any buffer stock. If you're going to sell corn at a fixed price, but then you run out of corn, game's over. You can't sell it anymore. And then the price starts floating because you've lost control. And so this is true for bank deposits as well. If you want to peg your bank deposits 1-to-1 to state money, then you need to have the state money to give people when they come try to redeem the bank deposits. And if you run out, then game over. And so this is a lot of the sources of the financial crises in the 1800s in the US and stuff. Is before we had, now what we have is institutions that make it so that banks do not run out of state money. Okay, in the US, we've got the Federal Reserve that acts as the lender of last resort that can always lend to banks. And then we've got the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, that makes sure that, if you've got money in a bank, then up to a certain limit, it'll be convertible to state money always. And so that means now the banks can run this buffer stock without any problem. But before that, they could have problems. And in fact, it was routine that bank deposits or banknotes would not trade one for one with state money. We had what was called the free banking era or the wildcat banking era. And banks were issuing these notes and they might say $1 on it. But if you take it to, take it to a store and want to pay somebody for groceries or something, then they're not going to accept that for $1 because they don't know this bank. They don't trust that they're going to be able to make good. So maybe this $1 note they only accept it for 80 cents or something like that, or 75 cents or whatever it is. Yeah. So we had in the US, we had hundreds or thousands of different paper monies circulating issued by private banks. And, each one of these $1 banknotes might have said $1, but out there in the market, because people didn't trust and know that the banks would be able to run these buffer stocks and really make good on the promise, the $1 note might only be worth 80 cents or 90 cents or whatever it was. They would trade at a discount.
So in this framework we're talking about government as price setter, Stephanie Kelton had an interesting exchange on Twitter at the back end of 2020, which I think goes to the heart of what we're talking about. Somebody tweeted this at her, quote, "In The Deficit Myth, the author, and it appears the Federal Reserve as well now, argued that we can run up the deficit until inflation appears. Just received my increase on the Medicare prescription drug insurance up 11%. I call that inflation. Stephanie Kelton, what say you?" And then Stephanie responds, "That's a clear example of government paying higher prices for the same thing," which Warren Mosley defines as inflation. And there's a pretty straightforward way to deal with it. And then she links to a study that shows that there's consensus among American voters, right to left, that the federal government should negotiate prices with drug companies for Medicare recipients. So you kind of touched on it a couple of beats ago about this idea that that's how, yes, the government is going to ratify market prices by paying them, but there's a lot government can do to change what the market wants. And you talked about antitrust and other things. Could you give some concrete examples? I mean, I think Stephanie laid out a pretty simple, straightforward one there, but do you have any other examples?
I mean, in the U.S., there's actually like a kind of growing movement to do this kind of work. I mean, one is in housing, and the Biden administration announced a couple months ago that they were going to build like 100,000 homes and sell them, and the point of that is to reduce the price of housing. Another, they are organized. They're like suing in antitrust lawsuits, like the meat packers in here, accusing those markets of being concentrated and it driving price increases. So they the way antitrust laws kind of work in the U.S. is they bring it to a court and they have a lawsuit and they say like you're violating the law by being whatever it is too concentrated of a market. I'm not like an antitrust expert, but and they either break up that industry and to make it more competitive, or they like subsidize the entrance of new competitors, or whatever they do to reduce the monopoly power in that industry, which is one way of getting the market to reduce its price increase asks. The more common macro ways that we're used to thinking about are like fiscal policy, monetary policy, like cut government spending or raise taxes or something so that you reduce demand for goods and services and that kind of thing. Because it's a lot easier for businesses. We're seeing it now, like with shortages and stuff, and we've seen like profit markups rise quite a bit. If you've got a product that's like in really high demand and you're basically sold out already, then like, what do you care? You can raise your price. I mean, you're not going to turn away customers that you're already like the line's out the door anyway, and you're just going to make more money on each one. So it's real easy for businesses to raise prices like when there's shortages. Now, they don't always do it. Like if you believe the supply and demand model, then okay, demand goes up, supply doesn't, so price should go up. And in the real world, it's not quite that simple. I mean, what you have like are like businesses with long-term customers that don't want to alienate them. It's like, I like to go to my supermarket. In fact, me personally, the supermarket I go to is like a worker-owned supermarket, and they're like local community, and I like them for this reason. And so I'm not just going there because of the prices. I'm going because of like some loyalty to the brand and the thing. And so if I started to get the sense that this business is like money grubbing price gougers or whatever, I'm going to stop going there. Like, even if the price goes down later, they've, damaged their reputation. So that is in the real world, there's those issues to worry about. And businesses don't just automatically raise prices just because they can. But that said, it's still true that when there's shortages, it's easier for them to do so. And especially in like the more anonymous markets, like retail markets tend to be, at least some retail markets can be about relationships, like me and my supermarket. There's some implied relationship there, maybe less so for like me in the gas station. But, and some business to business markets are like that too. You've got a supplier, you work with them for years, you build up a relationship. So the point of the price is not just to gouge the crap out of them to earn a quick buck right now, but you're setting that price with an eye to like, maintaining this relationship and not alienating them stuff and that kind of thing, and sharing the gains. But then there's other parts of the business world where it's really basically anonymous. You're never going to see these people again. You don't care. Raise the price while the line's out the door. Why not? So aggregate demand management is one of the ways we prevent that kind of inflation.
In your piece, when you've got us to understand the job guarantee as a buffer stock of employed labor, as you point out, it's only half a buffer stock. The government only buys labor. It wouldn't sell labor. So, Sam, wouldn't that impact the government's ability to stabilize prices?
Yeah, I think this is a really fascinating question. Because, right, so the way I explained the buffer stock earlier, to bring the price up, you buy more, right? That makes sense. Buy more, raise the price. To bring the price down, you sell stuff. You sell out into the market, the price goes down. It makes pretty good sense. But with this job guarantee, you might notice it's actually different than the gold standard, right? On the gold standard, they would buy and sell gold. But with the job guarantee, they only buy labor. They don't sell labor, right? Maybe they buy more or less labor, when like there's really not much demand for labor, in the private sector, the government will buy a lot of labor. But when demand's really hot in the private sector, they buy less labor, but still they're not selling labor. So how do they, how does that work? How do we understand it as a buffer stock if it's only like half of a buffer stock, or only, maybe you call it a one-way buffer stock maybe. And I think the way to understand this is actually to look at taxation. Okay, the government can always bring up the price of labor by buying more of it, right? And that's the buy side. But to bring it down, you can think of taxation as being the thing that deflates the economy, right? If the price of labor is getting too high, then they use their aggregate demand management policies, which could be, all kinds of things, and I list a few in there. But I think the easiest one to wrap your head around is just taxation. They use taxes, and it deflates the economy. People have less income, they buy fewer goods, aggregate demand goes down, prices fall. It deflates the economy until the price of labor falls back to the government's wage. So I'm not saying that like that would be an active thing that they would be doing. But what I'm saying is, for the job guarantee to work, they have to always be buying some labor. If private demand for labor is getting really high and all the workers are leaving the job guarantee for better paying jobs in the private sector, then the job guarantee is going to stop working as a way to control inflation. And so how do they deal with that? Well, they have to use some other demand management policy. You can just think of taxes, but some other demand management policy to bring the private labor demand back down, to release some workers into the job guarantee so that we're still running this buffer stock.
There already is this automatic stabilizer, right? As people move into the workforce, taxes being paid back to the government go up without any legislation. So the tax structure is quite progressive. If you ignore all the loopholes, it's quite progressive in that way.
This gets to something that I've been trying to write about here and there, and at some point I'll write more fully, but this is my view of fiscal sustainability, right? If you ask people what fiscal sustainability or, sustainability of the national debt, or what does that all mean? There's a lot of concepts out there and most of them are pretty bad. Some of them are any national debt is bad and that's just stupid. And there's kind of a mainstream economics concept which says, okay, the debt is sustainable as long as the interest rate on the debt is less than the growth rate of the economy. Because if the interest rate on the debt is too high, then the debt starts exploding because you're borrowing more and more to pay the interest or whatever. But if the interest rate on the debt is less than the growth rate on the economy, then the economy grows faster than the debt does. And so it's not going to just explode to infinity. And so you're fine. And some MMT authors have ran with that and said, oh, well, okay, so you're saying the national debt is sustainable as long as the interest rate on the debt is less than the growth rate, so then it doesn't grow too fast. Okay, well, because the government is the currency issuer and they've got a central bank and they can set interest rates, they can always set the interest rate to be less than the growth rate. So boom, the debt's sustainable because we just, sure, if we set our interest rates to 80%, then the debt would grow like crazy and get out of control really fast. But we just don't have to do that. We can set them to 1% or 0.5% or 0%, and then not a problem. So that's one conception of fiscal sustainability. But I actually have a different one. The way I think of fiscal sustainability is a bit different. For me, it's not about the interest rate basically at all. For me, it's about the automatic stabilizers, exactly what you're talking about, which is let's suppose we have really, really good automatic stabilizers. That's when, let's suppose government spending shrinks as the economy is doing well, is recovering from a recession, right? So in the recession, government spending is high because people need social services, people need unemployment checks or whatever. But then when the economy recovers, they don't need those things so much. So fewer people are claiming unemployment benefits and fewer people are getting, food stamps or whatever. And so government spending on those things shrinks automatically. And so that's an automatic stabilizer. It works in opposition to the economy. When the economy is growing really fast, the automatic stabilizer is slowing down the economy. When the economy is in the crapper, then the automatic stabilizer is helping provide a boost.
Simultaneously, when people are moving out of the unemployment pool, they're paying taxes again. So payments from the private sector to the government are going up as well, right? So the effect is that the deficit shrinks.
Yes, exactly. Income tax or progressive income tax is another really good automatic stabilizer. When the economy is recovering, incomes are rising. And so income tax revenue is rising as well. More income means you pay more taxes. So this is pulling more, income and wealth out of the economy. And so as the economy is recovering, is on its own, the government taxes are increasing. And so it's shrinking the deficit. Conversely, when the economy is falling off a cliff into a recession, then incomes are falling. And so income tax revenue is falling as well. And so that's increasing the deficit. And the point is, all of this is happening automatically. So my contention here is, it doesn't really matter what the interest rate does. What matters is how good are the automatic stabilizers? Because if the automatic stabilizers are really, really good, let's suppose that, the tax system and the benefits that we offer and all this are so good that they really swing really widely, a lot, right? The question is how much do they move? How automatic are they? If they were terrible and they didn't work, then tax revenue and government spending wouldn't change at all in a recession versus a recovery. They'd just be the same. Those would be crappy, they wouldn't be doing anything. On the other hand, when they're really good, then they do a lot. When the economy goes from recession to recovery, government spending would shrink a lot and taxes would rise a lot, right? Those would be good automatic stabilizers that can swing a lot. And my point is, if the automatic stabilizers are really, really good, then it doesn't matter what's happening with interest rates because the automatic stabilizers will compensate for it. That's kind of my argument. And so from that point of view, what you want to look at for fiscal sustainability is how good are the automatic stabilizers and how can we strengthen the automatic stabilizers? And you could you could try to do some modeling, econometric statistics or whatever and project if we do this policy under all the likely possible values of private spending and this kind of stuff, are we likely to have an inflation problem if we do nothing? And that would indicate that the automatic stabilizers aren't good enough and you need to make them better, make them swing more, right? And stabilize more. Or on the other hand, you might say, well, if we look at our automatic stabilizers, they're really good. We can do this policy and it's not going to cause any inflation. We're not going to have an unemployment problem. We have really good automatic stabilizers. In that case, well, then just kind of almost by definition, fiscal policy is sustainable, right? If you say we don't have to do anything because the automatic stabilizers do it for us, then sounds like good policy to me. So that's my even heterodoxer view of fiscal sustainability.
So I'm very much looking forward to seeing you write about this
someday.
So as we move into the home straight, Sam, do tell the listeners what you've got going on this year and the places to go online or otherwise to stay current with your work.
Let's see. What am I up to? Well, I just had a paper come out, my first peer-reviewed publication. So that's pretty exciting. It was Modern Money and the War Treasury in the Journal of Economic Issues. And I believe that we had an episode about that a while back.
Absolutely. We loved that before it was even cool to love that.
Thanks. So that's pretty exciting. The paper, that version of the paper is not too much different from the working paper version that is published on the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity's website. And that working paper version does not have a paywall.
Wink, wink.
So if you want to read it, there's the unpaywall version. Yeah. Although, I don't know, you want to read the new version, send me your email. I'll see what I can do.
Well, I think that's a great place to leave it. We've been talking to MMT scholar, teacher, and writer Sam Levey. And we'll link to all things Sam, to Sam's writing and how you can stay current with him in the show notes for this episode. But for now, thank you once again for joining us on the MMT podcast, Sam Levey.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much, guys. I love being on with you. So have a good one.
That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month and get access to patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino, and you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you.